history in the Second World War has borne him out step by step. Having no inclination to find himself once again enmeshed in another European cataclysm, Wagner left Germany in January 1926 for the United States, the only country in the world where he hoped to find true democracy and a people not inclined to share the fate of more or less doomed Europe. He foresaw then what is happening today, namely that Nazism and fascism did not stop communism, but on the contrary, sped its arrival in continental Europe. Having known personally such communist leaders as Dr. Karl Liebknecht and Rox Luxemburg, he recognized early the fatal destructiveness of the Marxian doctrine, while in Hitler he could never see anything else but a mad, crude, barbarian opportunist. In spite of better offers from Hollywood, Wagner insisted upon his arrival in this country to learn America from the bottom up. He spent several months as a factory hand in Detroit before he worked his way from the assembly line in Chicago up to the position of consulting radio engineer. Finally, in 1928, he returned to journalism by successfully being a reporter, a radio editor, drama editor, and finally associate editor with the Chicago Abendpost, a German language paper. He also worked as an American correspondent for three leading Austrian newspapers: Neue Freie Presse, Neus Wiener Journal, and the Neus Wiener Tagblatt. Sorry, my German's not perfect. Wagner's deep searching and analytical faculty revealed itself often in his journalistic career, but no more strikingly than when he popularized the philosophical meaning of Albert Einstein's equation of the field. While Einstein had himself announced that not more than 10 men in the entire world could grasp the meaning, Wagner published an essay, Einstein Finds the God of Science, about which Einstein wrote him that he had struck the very pitch of the matter, the God of Science. In 1932, Wagner moved to the foot of Long's Peak in Colorado to realize his old dream of living in the forest in the freest part of this free country. For several years, he lived in an old homestead log cabin in the woods, 9,000 feet altitude, just below the timberline, while writing analytical articles about the economic, social, political, cultural, and philosophical aspects of the American scene for European publications. After his marriage in 1935 to Winnie Sparks, art supervisor of the Board of Education of Chicago, and staff member of the Chicago Art Institute, he and his wife spent a year in New Mexico studying ancient culture of the American Indians. It is Wagner's contention that the future American culture, in whose rise he firmly believes, will be close to America's prehistoric cultures. So something to do with the Indians. I think I've discovered that as well. Having watched closely the rise of Hitler in Germany, partly by studying Nazi literature and its background, Wagner was early convinced that Hitler could menace the world only temporarily, a belief he still holds. However, when he began listening to Nazi shortwave broadcasts, he realized the threat that they constituted against American solidarity. Thus, in January 1939, he began his present work of analyzing the world's shortwave propaganda as a matter of absolutely necessary national defense. So by listening to what the Nazis were pumping into America on the radio and teaching all of us about it, he was providing national defense. The history of Wagner's present program. Wagner was the first in America who recognized the danger of Nazi infiltration by way of shortwave radio and the internet as of 2013. That'd be my opinion. And he was also the first who did something about it. 8 months before the present war started, he began checking and analyzing what all foreign shortwave stations were saying. He concentrated particularly on the German, Russian, and Italian stations. His fluency in German and 3 other European languages are an inestimable value in this work because it enables him check minutely what say the Nazis say for foreign and for home consumption. Meaning, he knows German, he can listen to what they're saying and then tell us, and translate. His work was so novel that it took the actual outbreak of the war in September 1939 before newspaper editors realized its importance. Wagner's idea was first to fight shortwave propaganda infiltration in a daily column which he sold to the Chicago Times, Chicago's second largest paper, in which he has been published since October 10th, 1939, under the heading "We Are Listening." His following among more than 400,000 daily readers of the Times was almost immediately established in the column syndicated in the Midwest. Wagner's column techniques is to quote the stations to which he listens, identify them all as to call the letters and time, and then analyze the meaning of their propaganda. He is one American columnist and citizen who was never scared of Hitler, and who maintained right along that no matter what would happen, Hitler would ultimately meet his end as a dictator and a world danger. Only a man with Wagner's intimate knowledge of Central Europe could logically defend such an optimistic position against the general pessimism which flooded the American press and radio during the first 18 months of the war. In addition, it took a profound sense of analysis to ferret out the true condition of Europe from the everlasting conflict propaganda statements of the warring nations. Like, each nation just says what it has to say to make itself look good, to make itself say what it wants to say. It's the battle of the swords of their tongue. Each nation is doing its own battle. While CBS and NBC listening posts can concentrate on picking up news items from foreign shortwave stations and use them as scoops, Wagner considered his work of analyzing shortwave propaganda of far greater importance. About a month and a half after his column had started in the Times, Princeton Listening Center at Princeton University started its work. But while Wagner scanned the entire shortwave horizon and rendered his analysis daily within a few hours after listening to the various foreign nations, Princeton published a monthly bulletin, very brief in text, on specific phases of certain shortwave stations. Thus, while Wagner's work was practical national defense in counteracting foreign propaganda on the spot, so to speak, Princeton merely furnished material for the historian of the later epoch. Which might be good for us to read. To this day, Wagner's work has been without competition, the reason being that it is too difficult to be undertaken without long preparation and experience. In his column, as well as in the correspondence with various government agencies and President Roosevelt, he has consistently requested that the government set up its own listening and analysis posts. I guess we have the NSA now. And that these be manned by capable people and capable of listening, translating, and analyzing all in one operation. Only in this way, Wagner says, is it possible to get an undiluted, uncontaminated, first-hand impression of shortwave propaganda, which is absolutely necessary for the basis of analysis. So, in June of 1940, Wagner moved his listening post from Chicago to his ranch in Tahosa Valley, which is where my grandma's property is, on the foot of Long's Peak. And I found all these papers in her house. So it's at the foot of Long's Peak in Allen's Park, Colorado. The location is at 8,415 feet, directly adjoining to the Rocky Mountain National Park and Roosevelt National Forest, and 14 miles south of Estes Park. Shortwave reception in that locality is infinitely superior to the Midwest or even nearby Rocky Mountain foothills. Wagner works in his high-powered receiving sets anywhere from 8 to 32 hours in one sitting, depending on the importance of the international situation. He listens to shortwave stations of the entire world, including Moscow, Tokyo, Chongqing Radio, Saigon, Rome, Berlin, London, Melbourne, and whatever station can give him a line at the time. He also listens to the rebel stations of Germany and Italy. He receives the same, but often much detailed propaganda handouts on which American correspondents in the foreign countries depend for their dispatches. But unlike them, whose dispatches are censored. He can give each and every propaganda item his own interpretation, unfettered and free. Thus, he was able to read between the lines of the Nazi propaganda in June of last year that there would not be an invasion of England. The British government, working with a staff of 600 shortwave analysts, arrived at the same time, at the same conclusion, for the same reasons as Wagner. This was a prime case for the importance of shortwave propaganda analysis as a matter of national defense beyond the aim of counteracting foreign propaganda infiltration into this country. So this is page 4 of 6 on the, I think it's background that he wrote himself, Siegfried Wagner. The German invasion of Russia was no surprise to Wagner. From analyzing Russian shortwave propaganda with regard to Germany and Nazi propaganda with regard to Russia, he had, since the very signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, told his readers and listeners that both nations were merely taking the time out to prepare for the day. So even though they both signed a peace treaty, he knew they were both going to war. Time after time, Wagner told the American public not to consider Russia Germany's ally. So he said, don't think Russia is Germany's ally. And not to believe that Russia delivered the raw materials, etc., of any consequence to Germany. He knew that the Russian-German radios had said out each other before the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and he knew that the ice-cold neutrality which they observed on the air after the pact would someday burst into open hostility. After the Russian campaign started, nonetheless, but Hitler himself and the Nazi editor-in-chief of the Deutschland Reichsrundfunk Gesellschaft made statements which proved word for word that Wagner had been saying for the last year and a half that he was right. Like being a prophet by listening to the propaganda of the world and telling everybody what's going to happen before it happens. The same happened with regard to Italy. Early in the spring of 1940, Wagner stated that the morale of the Italian people had completely broken down. A sudden change in shortwave propaganda methods by the Rome radio gave him reason to believe that inside Italy the German army had taken over and that Italy was virtually on the verge of revolution, which only the Nazis kept at bay. John T. Whitaker, the Rome correspondent of the Chicago Daily News, confirmed everything Wagner had said when Whitaker was forced to leave Rome several months after Wagner had correctly analyzed the Italian situation. Wagner is so close to the actual state of affairs of international politics that only 2 weeks before President Roosevelt met Prime Minister Winston Churchill, he devoted most of his mutual network broadcast to the subject of concrete peace aims. He said at the time that the entire British-inspired V for Victory campaign in Central Europe would fizzle if it was not immediately backed up by the peace proposition which the German people could embrace once they ridded themselves of Hitler. Wagner suggested something on the order of Wilson's 14 points, which he himself sold to the German people in 1918, and he emphasized that America should underwrite them. And as the world knows, that was exactly what Roosevelt and Churchill did in the mid-Atlantic. Wagner was the first who reported the American bombers fighting for Russia because the Nazis said so in their own action reports. Forever on the jump to catch the shortwave propagandists unaware, he was also the first to prove by the Nazis' own statements that the Red Army was fighting heroically and that the Russian people stood solidly behind their government. Refusing to swallow anti-communist propaganda in this country hook, line, and sinker, these world surprises did not surprise Wagner, who years ago predicted that the Russian army would not be a pushover for the Nazis. Wherever one looks in the field of international politics, Wagner's predictions came true, and his analysis proved correct. He listened to the entire world, and he listens himself. He has done so for close to 3 years, and what he hears, he checks against